Reid's days bled into one another, a monotonous watercolor of spreadsheets and lukewarm coffee. His office, a cubicle bathed in the hum of fluorescent lights, was a cage he'd long since stopped rattling. He pushed numbers around a screen, a silent, dutiful cog in a vast, indifferent machine. Determination, once a sharp edge within him, had dulled to a persistent, quiet hum, a refusal to completely surrender to the gray. He'd always believed there was more, even as the evidence mounted against it. Then came the call, a jarring intrusion into the predictable rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon. The voice on the other end, clipped and formal, belonged to a solicitor he'd never heard of. "Mr. Reid," the voice inquired, thin and reedy. "Regarding the estate of a distant relative." Reid frowned, his finger hovering over a column of figures. He had no living relatives he was aware of, certainly none that would have an estate. He vaguely recalled a great-aunt, twice removed, who'd vanished from family lore decades ago, a whisper of eccentricity and reclusiveness. He'd never met her. The solicitor explained, his words careful, almost too precise. The relative, a woman named Elara Thorne, had passed suddenly. Mysteriously, the solicitor implied, though he wouldn't elaborate over the phone. And Reid, by some obscure twist of lineage, was his sole inheritor. An old cabin, deep in the forgotten stretch of the Blackwood Forest. A cabin. Reid stared at his monitor, the glowing numbers suddenly meaningless. The idea felt like a misplaced piece from another life. He thanked the solicitor, hung up, and for the first time in years, the hum of his determination sharpened into something like curiosity. This was an escape, a disruption. A chance, perhaps, to finally rattle the bars. 2 weeks later, Reid found himself behind the wheel of his sedan, the city shrinking in his rearview mirror. The initial jolt of excitement had settled into a quiet apprehension. The solicitor had provided sparse details about the cabin, only reiterating its extreme isolation and hinting at local superstitions regarding the land it stood on. An ancient burial ground, he'd murmured, almost dismissively, as if it were a quaint, harmless rumor. As he drove, the concrete arteries of the highway gave way to winding country roads, then to narrower, unpaved tracks. The sky overhead, once a clear, hopeful blue, became a muted canvas, streaked with bruised purples and grays. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The trees, initially scattered and welcoming, began to press in, their branches weaving a dense, shadowy canopy. The light filtering through became fractured, dappled, then almost entirely swallowed. Hours into the drive, the GPS signal sputtered and died, leaving Reid to rely on the faded, hand-drawn map the solicitor had provided. The sense of isolation deepened with every mile, a growing knot in his stomach. He approached a clearing, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, in faded letters, "Border Checkpoint, Private Land Beyond." The official merely nodded, a curt gesture, and waved Reid through, never speaking a word, never asking for identification. It was less a checkpoint and more a gateway, a silent acknowledgement that he was passing into a different kind of territory, one beyond the usual reach of jurisdiction. The encounter left an unsettling impression, a prickle of unease that lingered. Beyond the checkpoint, the track narrowed further, becoming little more than a pair of ruts carved into the forest floor. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and thick, their branches interwoven so tightly that the sky was all but obscured. It felt as though he was driving into the belly of something vast and ancient. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. The cabin. It sat hunched and low, almost swallowed by the encroaching forest. Gray, weather-beaten planks formed its walls, the roof sagging slightly under a thick blanket of moss and dead leaves. A stone chimney, crumbling at the top, rose crookedly into the twilight. It wasn't just old, it felt forgotten. Not merely abandoned, but deliberately left behind, erased from memory by the forest itself. A shiver, unrelated to the dropping temperature, traced its way down Reid's spine. The air around the cabin seemed to hold its breath. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The scent of pine was stronger here, almost overwhelming, laced with something else he couldn't quite place, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and decaying flowers. The cabin didn't just sit on the land, it seemed to emerge from it, a natural, disturbing growth. He had sought a disruption, an escape from the mundane. He had found it. He'd barely registered her existence, a distant whisper from a forgotten branch of the family tree, now reduced to a stark, official pronouncement of death and inheritance. A cold tendril of curiosity, a rare sensation for Reid, uncoiled in his gut. He had no other ties, no pressing commitments. He would go. He would see this place for himself. The drive stretched for hours, the asphalt gradually giving way to gravel, then to a rough, overgrown track. The world thinned around him, the familiar landmarks of civilization receding into a hazy memory. He passed a solitary structure, a ramshackle building with a faded sign, a border checkpoint. A uniformed officer, face weathered and expressionless, waved him down. The air tasted of pine and damp earth, thick and ancient. The officer glanced at Reid's identification, then at the destination listed on the estate papers. A flicker, something unreadable, crossed the officer's eyes before he simply nodded, gesturing for Reid to proceed. No questions, no pleasantries. Just a silent, almost somber acknowledgement that Reid was crossing a threshold. The gesture lingered in Reid's mind, a small, unsettling detail. Further in, the trees grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead, forming a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, damp with the scent of decaying leaves and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old iron. Then, through a break in the canopy, he saw it. The cabin. It wasn't picturesque. He pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned in protest, releasing a puff of stale, dust-laden air. The interior was dim, even with the midday sun filtering through the grime-streaked panes. The scent inside was stronger now, a cloying mix of mildew, forgotten spices, and something else, a faint, lingering sweetness that turned his stomach. He moved through the rooms, each one a tableau of halted time. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fuzzy blanket over antique furniture and faded tapestries. He ran a hand over a wooden table, leaving a clean streak in the accumulated years. That first evening, as dusk bled into the deep indigo of night, the cabin began to speak. He was in the kitchen, attempting to clear a space for rudimentary cooking, when a distinct thump echoed from the floor above him. He paused, a damp cloth in his hand, listening. The house was old, he reasoned, settling. The groan of ancient beams. A gust of wind. He dismissed it, returning to scrubbing the counter. A moment later, a faint scrape drifted from the hallway, like something being dragged across bare floorboards. He walked out, peered into the gloom. Nothing. Later, in what he assumed was the main living area, he found himself drawn to a large, unlit fireplace. He spun, but there was only the steady gloom, the heavy furniture looming like silent witnesses. He told himself it was the dying light, a trick of the eye, a branch outside swaying against the window. Yet, a tiny pinprick of unease pricked at his resolve. He spent the next few days in a determined effort to make the cabin habitable. He aired out rooms, swept away decades of dust, and tried to impose some order. It was during this process that the disturbances subtly escalated. He'd leave a stack of books neatly piled on a shelf, only to find them scattered across the floor an hour later, as if swept by an invisible hand. He'd set his coffee mug on a table, turn his back for a moment, and find it inexplicably moved to the other side of the room. Each time, he'd rationalize it away. He must have forgotten, he was tired, the house was settling. But the explanations felt increasingly thin, like gauze stretched over a gaping wound. One afternoon, while clearing out an old pantry, he noticed a section of the wooden wall paneling that seemed slightly looser than the rest. Curiosity overriding his growing irritation with the cabin's quirks, he pried at it with the tip of his knife. The panel gave way with a soft creak, revealing a shallow recess. Inside, nestled among cobwebs and fine dust, was a single, leather-bound volume. It was not a journal, but a book of sermons, its cover intricately embossed with a symbol he didn't recognize, a stylized, thorny vine encircling an open palm. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and many of the pages were blank, interspersed with strange, meticulous annotations in a cramped, faded script. It wasn't the content that truly caught his attention, but the way it was hidden, the care taken to conceal it. He carefully extracted the book, brushing away the dust. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards beneath his feet. The cabin seemed to sigh around him, a long, drawn-out exhalation. Reid clutched the book, its weight unexpectedly heavy in his hands. He told himself it was just an old house, a collection of creaks and groans. The crumpled notice had been a cold ember in Reid's hand, its elegant script a stark pronouncement that echoed the silence of the cabin. A great aunt, twice removed. The words still felt alien, a phantom limb of a family tree he'd never known. He'd folded it, then unfolded it, then tucked it into the pocket of his jacket, a morbid talisman against the encroaching strangeness. But the paper offered no protection. The phenomena didn't merely continue, they sharpened, growing teeth. What had been fleeting shadows and tricks of the light now pressed closer, undeniable. The air inside the cabin, once merely damp and cool, began to carry a scent Reid couldn't place, an earthy sweetness mixed with something metallic, like old pennies and turned soil after a heavy rain. It clung to the rough-hewn walls, seeped into the very fabric of his clothes, and tasted faintly on his tongue. He was in the kitchen one evening, slicing an apple, when the heavy iron skillet hanging above the stove began to sway, not with the gentle creak of settling wood, but with a deliberate, rhythmic motion, like a pendulum. There was no breeze, no open window. Reid froze, the knife poised over the fruit, his gaze fixed on the swinging metal. It gained momentum, a low, resonant clack-clack-clack against the stone hearth, before slowly, impossibly, coming to a dead stop. Not a gradual fade, but an abrupt halt, as if an invisible hand had caught it mid-swing. The apple slipped from his numb fingers, thudding softly to the floorboards. Not distinct words, but a low, guttural murmur that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his bed, then from the ceiling above. It was a chorus of hushed voices, too many to count, too indistinct to decipher, like a conversation happening just beyond the threshold of understanding. He would sit bolt upright, straining his ears, the blood thrumming behind his eardrums, but the moment he focused, the sound would dissipate, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves outside. Yet, a faint echo, a lingering resonance, always remained, a phantom vibration in the deep quiet. He tried to rationalize it all, to cling to the logical explanations. The cabin was old, the forest alive with sound. His mind, stressed and isolated, was playing tricks. They were real, concrete invasions of his reality, chipping away at his composure. Reid was determined. Though he wouldn't abandon his inheritance, not yet. This wasn't just a property, it was a mystery, and it was his. He needed answers, a tether to understanding amidst the unraveling. His research began modestly, with his laptop. He delved into digital archives, scanned local historical societies' websites, and even tried to piece together his distant relative's life. The relative, a reclusive woman named Elara, had left behind almost no digital footprint. Her name appeared only in a handful of property records and an obituary so sparse it seemed intentionally vague. He expanded his search to the history of the land itself. The local library, a small brick building in the nearest town, held a promise of tangible history. Getting there meant a drive, a significant one through winding forest roads. And then, the border checkpoint. The wooden barrier, painted a faded hunter green, looked more like a prop from an old movie than an active checkpoint. A single, uniformed officer, his face weathered and stern, stepped out of a small booth as Reid approached. The air here felt different, thinner, imbued with a quiet tension that hummed beneath the drone of the forest. Purpose of visit, the officer asked, his voice flat, his eyes scanning Reid's vehicle, then his face. Research, Reid replied, feeling the word inadequate, almost foolish. Local history. The cabin, you know. The one. Up in the old woods. He gestured vaguely behind him. The officer's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. That cabin, he repeated, a slight pause before the words. Isolated place. Not many come and go from there. You the new owner? Reid nodded, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. The officer didn't smile, didn't offer any pleasantries. He simply stared for another long moment, then slowly, deliberately, waved him through. The barrier lifted with a groan, and Reid drove past, feeling the officer's eyes on his rearview mirror until the bend in the road obscured him. The interaction, brief and unremarkable, left him feeling scrutinized, as if he'd crossed not just a physical border, but an invisible threshold into something guarded. At the library, the librarian, a woman with kind eyes and spectacles perched on her nose, was more welcoming. She pointed him towards the local history section. Among dusty tomes and brittle newspaper clippings, Reid found fragments. A brief mention of the ancient burial mounds in the region, dismissed as local superstition in one article, then alluded to with hushed reverence in another, much older, piece about the founding families. He found a faded photograph, yellowed with age, of a stern-faced woman who bore a striking, unsettling resemblance to Elara, his great-aunt. The caption simply read, a matriarch of the family, dated nearly a century ago. But what truly stopped him, what made his breath catch in his throat, was a small, almost illegible entry in a handwritten parish ledger from the late 1700s. It wasn't about the cabin directly, but about the land it stood upon. A property transfer, detailing conditions for ownership. They were a prelude. And the pact, whatever it was, had been kept for generations. Now, it seemed, it was his turn. Reid stood amidst the cabin's oppressive silence, the faint echo of the previous night's whispers still clinging to the air like a shroud. The jumbled notes, the unsettling dates, the unsettling sense of a presence that was not merely haunting but claiming, it all coalesced into a desperate, cold determination. He wouldn't just endure this, he would unravel it. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a cage, its walls now seemingly flexing with unseen intent. He began his systematic search, a frantic energy propelling him. He ran his hands along every rough-hewn plank, tapped on walls, tested the give of floorboards. The scent of aged wood and damp earth was thick, occasionally punctuated by a faint, metallic tang he couldn't place. He moved from room to room, a growing certainty nagging at him that the answer wasn't simply in the cabin, but of it, hidden away like a forgotten organ. In the main living area, near the massive stone hearth, a loose flagstone caught his eye. It sat slightly askew, unlike its perfectly mortared brethren. He knelt, scraping away decades of soot and grime with a fingernail, revealing a hairline crack where there shouldn't have been one. With a grunt, he wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. He recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. It was a small chamber, barely big enough for a person to crouch, lined with rough, unmortared stones. He pulled it out, the weight surprising him. It was heavy, dense with its contents. Inside, nestled amongst brittle, yellowed parchment, lay a thick, leather-bound journal. Its cover was etched with symbols he didn't recognize, intricate and unsettling, like twisted roots or veins. He opened it, the spine groaning in protest. The ink was faded, the script elegant but difficult to decipher in the dim light. He carried it to the window, the pages rustling like dry leaves. The journal belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Elara. Her entries, spanning decades, detailed not just daily life but a terrifying, escalating bargain. She wrote of the land's original inhabitants, their rituals, and the ancient guardian that dwelled beneath the earth, a hunger embodied. His ancestors, in their greed for prosperity and protection from a harsh world, had made a pact. Not with a deity, but with the land itself, or rather, the malevolent consciousness that festered within it. The blood of the line ensures the bounty of the earth, one passage read, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had shaken. But the earth demands its due. One soul, given willingly or taken by force, at each turning of the century. The guardian feeds, and the line endures. Reid's eyes raced, devouring the words. Sacrifice. His lineage. The cabin, built upon the ancient burial ground, wasn't just a place, it was a nexus. The entity wasn't some wandering spirit, it was bound to this soil, a parasitic anchor, its tendrils reaching through generations. The cabin hummed around him, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in his teeth. He felt a profound sickness, a visceral rejection of the truth unfurling before him. He was not just an heir, he was a potential offering. He had to get out. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white, and stumbled towards the door. He threw a few essentials into a bag, the journal tucked securely inside, and got into his aging vehicle. He drove, pushing the vehicle faster than he should, the dirt road blurring beneath his tires. He needed distance. He needed to be free of the forest, of the cabin, of the guardian's reach. He was almost out. He slowed, pulling up to the barrier. An officer, a burly figure bundled in a heavy coat, emerged from a small booth, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. The air here was sharp, clean, devoid of the cabin's clinging scent. "Evening," the officer said, his voice flat. "Purpose of travel?" Reid fumbled for his identification. "Just leaving." A pause stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Reid felt a tremor of unease. He was so close. "You've been up in the old forest," the officer stated, not a question. His gaze settled on the worn leather of Reid's bag, where the journal's corner was just visible. "That cabin, the old Reid place?" Reid nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Especially not this time of year." He handed back the license, but didn't lift the barrier. "There's a local ordinance. Prevents travel across this line, from that area, without proper documentation. Collecting artifacts." His gaze flickered to the journal again, then back to Reid's eyes, holding him. The border checkpoint wasn't a gateway to freedom, it was another wall, erected by the ancient pact, and he was trapped. The officer's eyes seemed to deepen, to reflect something ancient and hungry. The officer's eyes, dark and unreadable, met his. "Don't see many folks coming out of there, not for long, anyway. Local ordinance. Prevents travel across the border checkpoint after sunset, into the surrounding territories. Safety measure." Reid's jaw tightened. "It's barely past 4. And what kind of ordinance is that?" "Reid need to leave." He gestured vaguely back towards the cabin, a place he now desperately wanted to put behind him. The air here, at the edge of the forgotten forest, felt thinner, colder, imbued with a watchful stillness that prickled his skin. He heard no birdsong, only the sigh of wind through unseen pines. The officer merely shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "Ordnance is the ordnance. Patrols stop at sundown. Roads aren't safe." His gaze drifted past Reid, into the dense woods that flanked the narrow track leading back to the cabin. He took a step forward, intending to push past the barrier, to force the issue. But as his foot landed, the ground beneath him seemed to lurch. A wave of profound disorientation washed over him, blurring the edges of the officer's uniform, twisting the stark outlines of the checkpoint booth. He stumbled, catching himself on the cold metal of the barrier. The officer remained unmoving, a statue of indifference. Reid squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear his head, to shake off the sudden, debilitating vertigo. This wasn't just an ordinance, it was an active force, pushing his back, holding him captive. He glanced at the officer, whose expression remained impassive, as if entirely oblivious to the cacophony that now screamed in Reid's ears. The officer wasn't stopping him, something else was. With a heavy heart, Reid turned the vehicle around, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like breaking bones. He drove back down the winding path, each turn tightening the invisible noose around him. The cabin, when it finally reappeared through the thinning trees, no longer looked like a refuge. Inside, the air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of dust and something metallic. The silence was not empty, but pregnant with anticipation. Reid tried his phone. No signal. He tried again. Nothing. He walked from room to room, holding the device aloft, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. The cabin was a dead zone, cut off from the outside world. He found himself in the study, drawn to the heavy, ornate desk where he'd found the old journal. He needed a distraction, something to anchor him to reality. He pulled out the journal, its leather cover cool beneath his fingers. He flipped through the familiar, cramped script, seeking some explanation, some key to his predicament. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration started in the floorboards. It grew, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath the cabin. Then, the framed photographs on the mantelpiece began to tremble, their glass faces rattling softly. Reid's gaze snapped to the nearest window. Reflected in the glass, behind his own pale image, was not the dim room, but a fleeting, distorted vision of a figure standing just behind him. He spun around, heart hammering against his ribs, but the room behind him was empty. The cabin was no longer merely a place of strange occurrences, it was a living, breathing entity, and it was actively hostile. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through the desk, making the journal in his hands shake. He focused on the page he'd been reading, trying to make sense of the increasingly chaotic script. The lineage. A sacrifice. The binding. His eyes darted to a crudely drawn symbol scrawled in the margin, a twisted knot of lines, vaguely organic, like roots intertwined with bones. It was the same symbol he'd seen carved into the floorboards beneath the loose plank, the same symbol he'd briefly glimpsed on the amulet described in the journal. It wasn't from inside the cabin, but outside, a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the surrounding forest. It was a human sound, raw and terrified, abruptly cut short. Reid froze, every nerve in his body screaming. He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The shriek had been clear, unmistakable. It sounded like a woman. A woman he knew. He fumbled for his phone again, his fingers shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He tried to dial a colleague, a close friend he had spoken to just yesterday, who had promised to check in on him. The call failed, and again. Such a tender heart. A pity. The voice was ancient, raspy, layered with something that sounded like rustling leaves and grinding stone. The shriek, the voice, the severed connection. The entity wasn't just trapping him, it was reaching out, threatening those he cared about, using them as leverage. The horror was no longer confined to the cabin, or to his perception. It was real, external, and devastatingly personal. The cabin wasn't just a trap, it was a cage, and the entity was tightening its grip, ready to consume not just him, but everything he held dear. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, and the game had just begun. The deadline on the phone's screen mirrored the sudden, icy stillness in Reid's gut. The shriek, the distorted voice, the chilling implication that the entity could reach beyond the cabin's ancient walls, into the lives of those he cared about. It wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a weapon, wielded against his loved ones. A primal, desperate rage ignited within him, scorching away the last vestiges of his fear. He wouldn't just endure, he would fight. He would escape. His hands, trembling just moments before, now moved with a fierce, almost manic energy. He snatched the truck keys from the hook by the door, the metal cold against his palm. His gaze darted around the living room, settling on the heavy iron poker by the hearth. Not much, but it felt solid, real. He gripped it, the weight reassuring in a world that felt increasingly intangible. He flung open the front door, the hinges groaning in protest. The forest air, usually damp and earthy, now felt thick, cloying, like breathing through a shroud. He practically fell into the truck, fumbling the key into the ignition. Reid slammed the gear into reverse, gravel spitting from under the tires as he spun the truck around. He sped down the dirt track, the beams of his headlights carving a frantic tunnel through the encroaching night. Trees, once just silent sentinels, now seemed to lean in, their branches skeletal fingers reaching, scratching against the air. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine whining in protest, but the truck felt sluggish, as if driving through treacle. Had he already passed the main road? Was he somehow driving in circles? He remembered the old legends about lost travelers in these woods, their sense of direction irrevocably twisted. A knot tightened in his stomach. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. No. Not me. Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded his chest, making him gasp. He was getting out. He was getting out. He focused on the distant glow, pushing the truck faster, the iron poker clattering on the passenger seat as he rounded a particularly sharp bend. A small, utilitarian building, a raised barrier arm, and the faint glow of fluorescent lights. His heart hammered against his ribs, but this time not from fear, but from a desperate surge of hope. He was almost there. He could explain. He could get help. He slowed, pulling up to the barrier. A figure emerged from the small building, a uniformed officer, their face obscured by the distance and the glare of the light. Reid rolled down his window, the fresh air, even with its lingering metallic tang, a welcome relief. "Excuse me," Reid called out, his voice hoarse, "I need help. I need to get through. There's something wrong, something terrible back there at the cabin." He gestured wildly behind him, toward the impenetrable forest. The officers stepped closer, their movements stiff, almost mechanical. Their uniform was impeccable, creased perfectly, but something about their posture felt off, too rigid. As they drew into the pool of light, Reid saw their face. It was utterly devoid of expression, smooth as polished stone. Their eyes, though, were the most unsettling. They were wide, unblinking, and seemed to hold an ancient, fathomless emptiness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't speaking to a person, but an echo, a mimicry. "Papers? I don't have them. I just need to get through. My family, they're in danger." The officer tilted their head fractionally, a movement that seemed to stretch the muscles of their neck in an unnatural way. "Regulations require proper identification for passage, sir. This is a secure zone." "Secure?" Reid scoffed, a hysterical edge creeping into his voice. "From what?" "From it? It's already out. It's already reaching." He pounded a fist on the dashboard. "Just lift the barrier. Please." The officer remained impassive, their gaze fixed on some point just beyond Reid's shoulder. "Compliance is mandatory, sir." Reid stared at them, a sickening realization blooming in his chest. This wasn't a person. This was another projection, another cruel mockery. The air around the checkpoint began to shimmer, the fluorescent lights flickering with an impossible rhythm. The officer's uniform seemed to warp, the fabric rippling like water, their skin stretching, tightening. Reid tried to put the vehicle in reverse, but the gear shift was locked, immovable. He tried the accelerator, the engine revved uselessly, the tires spinning on nothing. And then, with a sound like tearing fabric and splintering wood, the world outside the truck's windows dissolved. The truck was no longer facing the checkpoint but the cabin, miles back down the winding, unbroken dirt track. The headlights illuminated the dense wall of trees, exactly as they had been when he'd first started his desperate escape. Reid's breath hitched. He wasn't just trapped, he was being toyed with. The entity wasn't merely blocking his path, it was actively manipulating his perception, bending reality to its will. The reveal was a crushing weight. The outside world wasn't a refuge, it was an extension of the prison. The cabin's influence wasn't confined, it was pervasive, insidious, stretching its tendrils even to the very boundaries of human jurisdiction. His hands began to shake violently, the iron poker now feeling impossibly heavy, useless. He had fought, he had tried to escape, but the forest itself had become a conscious, malicious force, twisting his journey into a cruel loop. He was not just physically trapped, his mind, too, was now a plaything. The walls of his sanity, already weakened, began to crack. The flickering fluorescent lights at the border checkpoint cast long, wavering shadows that danced like phantoms. Reid's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in his gut. The officer's uniform, once crisp and authoritative, now seemed to ripple, the fabric stretching and shrinking as if caught in an invisible current. He wasn't looking at a person, not anymore. This was a grotesque mimicry, a cruel, detailed puppet animated by something unseen. The officer's face began to contort, the skin pulling taut over cheekbones that sharpened unnaturally, then softened into a doughy slackness. It was not a voice, it was the impression of a voice, a vibration that resonated in Reid's teeth and skull, bypassing his ears entirely. You came. Reid instinctively stepped back, his hand fumbling for purchase on the cold metal frame of the vehicle door. The border checkpoint itself seemed to waver, the concrete walls blurring at the edges, the distant mountains visible through the glass booth morphing into jagged, unfamiliar peaks. The officer's form swelled, growing taller, broader, until it seemed to fill the entire booth. The uniform tore, not with the sound of fabric ripping, but with a wet, tearing sound like flesh. The pact. Unbroken. The blood. Remembers. The words weren't spoken, they were implanted directly into Reid's mind, each syllable a shard of ice. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to fight the overwhelming assault, but the images came anyway, unbidden, vivid, horrific. He saw the cabin, not as he knew it, but ancient, crude, its timbers freshly cut. Figures moved around it, gaunt men and women, there. Faces etched with a desperate hope and a terrible fear. They stood around a freshly dug pit, not for a foundation, but for something else. The air pulsed with a raw, hungry energy. The vision intensified. He saw an old man, his own spitting image in the deep set of his eyes, raising a crude bone knife. A child, no older than 5, stood trembling beside him, her small hand clutching a wooden doll. The ancestors chanted, a low, droning sound that vibrated through Reid's very bones. The old man cut his own palm, letting the blood drip into the pit. Then, the child. The old man, his face a mask of grief and grim determination, took her hand, the bone knife glinting. Reid gasped, his eyes flying open. The border checkpoint was gone. It was the land itself, sentient, malevolent, given form. It was the burial ground, the forest, the cabin, all one single, terrible entity. It feeds on the fear, the sacrifice, the bloodline. The thought voice was 1,000 voices now, a chorus of the lost and the damned. We gave it life. We bound it. We offered to thrive. Reid understood. His ancestors, desperate for prosperity, for safety in a harsh, unforgiving land, had made a pact. They had offered the land, the thing in the land, a portion of their own, a regular, generational tithe of life and fear. The cabin, built upon the heart of this ancient, ravenous intelligence, was both its prison and its altar. The pact renews with the air, the blood. It wasn't deep, just a surface scratch, but it glowed with an eerie, internal light. It was a brand, a claim. You are the vessel, the bridge, the offering. The words were a hammer blow. Reid was not just an heir to a cabin, he was an heir to a debt, a lineage of sacrifice. The entity demanded not just a sacrifice, but the sacrifice from the bloodline itself. And now, it was calling for him. Or, perhaps, for someone through him. It wanted the fear, the life force of someone tied to him. The stench of rot intensified, then receded. The distorted form of the officer began to shimmer, the tendrils retracting, the shapeless mass compacting. The fluorescent lights flickered back into a normal rhythm. The walls of the border checkpoint solidified. Reid was back, leaning against the vehicle, gasping for air, the cold metal biting into his hand. Are you going to proceed, or do Reid need to call someone? Reid stared back, his mind reeling, the stench of burnt bones still clinging to his nostrils, the phantom pain in his palm throbbing. He had seen it. He had felt it. The entity was not merely haunting the cabin, it was the cabin, the land, a primal hunger that had been fed for generations. And now, it was his turn to feed it. He knew what it wanted. He knew who it wanted. The only way to appease it, to break the curse, was to complete the blood pact, one final, horrific sacrifice. His own, or that of someone he cared for, someone intimately connected to him. It was a choice, but not really a choice at all. The cabin waited, a hulking silhouette against the bruised twilight, not just a structure but a maw. Reid felt it, the gnawing hunger, the ancient pulse thrumming beneath the floorboards, through the very air. He had seen it, felt it, the entity was the land, the wood, the generations of quiet agony. And now, he would meet it. He gripped the worn leather-bound journal in one hand, the crude, heavy iron poker from the fireplace in the other. His palms still ached with the phantom burn, a reminder of the entity's touch, its insidious claim. Fear, a cold, hard knot, tightened in his stomach, but beneath it, a brittle resolve had taken root. He would not simply flee. He could not. The cabin had become a part of him, or perhaps he, a part of it. The door, unlatched, swung inward with a faint, drawn-out whine, revealing an interior swallowed by shadows. Inside, the cabin was a tomb. No, worse. A living, breathing cage. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, not randomly, but in deliberate, swirling patterns, like tiny, unseen currents guiding them. Reid's breath hitched. He had deciphered enough of the cryptic scrawls in the journal. The pact wasn't merely about sacrifice, it was about sustenance, about anchoring the entity to this place, to this lineage. And the only way to break it, the journal hinted, was to sever that connection at its deepest point, the hearth, the heart of the cabin, the true altar. He moved into the main room, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the creaking floor. He reached the hearth, the focal point of the cabin's malevolence. He could feel it now, the raw power thrumming just beneath the surface, like a vast, unseen engine. The very stones felt alive, warm and slick despite the freezing air. He had gathered the items, a small, carefully chosen collection of personal effects from the old relative, things that held a connection to the bloodline, to the pact. He placed them one by one onto the cold stone of the hearth, a tarnished silver locket, a dried sprig of a forgotten herb, a small, smooth river stone. Each item seemed to hum faintly as it touched the ancient surface. As the last item settled, a low, guttural moan filled the cabin, rising from the floorboards, seeping from the walls. The very air vibrated, rattling the glass in the windows, sending shivers down Reid's spine. The cabin began to breathe. The walls seemed to expand and contract, the ceiling to heave like a vast, unseen chest. They were accusing, demanding, hungry. Reid clenched the iron poker. This was the event. He plunged the poker into the loose earth at the back of the hearth, where the old relative's notes indicated the deepest connection lay. The moment the iron pierced the soil, the cabin screamed. Not a sound, but a feeling, a raw, tearing agony that ripped through Reid's mind, making his knees buckle. The floorboards buckled and tore, splintering with explosive force. A chasm opened in the center of the room, not deep, but wide, revealing black, churning earth beneath. He felt himself being pulled, drawn towards the gaping maw on the floor, towards the primal hunger. He fought against it, digging his heels into the remaining floor. The air around him shimmered, distorting, twisting his vision. The cabin dissolved, for a moment, into a desolate landscape. Beyond it, nothing but an impenetrable, swirling gray mist. The entity was showing him his prison, his ultimate entrapment. But he pushed through the illusion, the crushing weight of despair. He remembered the journal's final, desperate line, "Sacrifice not the blood, but the bond." He ripped his hand free from the poker, which now vibrated with a malevolent energy, and plunged his other hand into the churning earth of the hearth, deep into the soil he had disturbed. It was the heart of the entity, the anchor of the pact. With a scream that tore his throat, Reid pulled. He wasn't pulling a physical object, but a tether, a spiritual bond that had held his lineage captive for generations. The cabin convulsed violently, groaning, splitting. The walls cracked, dust and splinters raining down. The unholy light from the hearth flared, blinding him. He pulled harder, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring. He heard a final, deafening roar, a sound of pure, ancient rage and agony, as if the earth itself was being flayed. Then, with a sickening snap, the connection broke. The cabin shuddered, then went still. He had faced it. He had pulled the cord. But at what cost? He looked at his hand, covered in soil, and knew something profound had shifted, not just in the cabin, but within himself. The pact was broken, but the entity's presence, though diminished, felt like a scar etched into the very fabric of his being. He gripped the cold, pulsing knot. It was not flesh, not stone, yet it yielded with a sickening give, like an organ tearing from its moorings. A shriek, not of sound but of pure, vibrating agony, tore through the cabin, rattling the very timbers. It was a scream that originated in his bones, vibrating up his arm from the thing he held. He felt the earth around his hand convulse, churning violently, warm soil turning to icy sludge. Then, a final, wrenching pull, and the knot came free. Silence. Reid's hand, slick with damp earth and something else he couldn't name, trembled as he slowly withdrew it. The hearth, where the earth had writhed, was now still. A shallow depression marked the spot where the pulsing knot had been, and from it, a faint, acrid vapor rose, smelling of ozone and something anciently dead. The skin was intact, unmarked, yet it felt as if a branding iron had been pressed into his palm. He could still feel the phantom grip of the knot, its alien texture imprinted on his nerves. The cabin felt different. The air, once thick with unseen menace, was now thin, almost sterile. But it wasn't a clean feeling. It was the sterile emptiness of a drained wound, the lingering scent of something terrible having been present. He looked around, his eyes scanning the familiar, yet now alien, room. The furniture stood inert. He had done something, irrevocably. He stumbled from the hearth, his legs unsteady, his entire body wrung out. Every muscle ached, every joint protested. He felt as though he had wrestled with a physical beast for days, not just plunged his hand into the earth for a few terrifying seconds. The exhaustion was absolute, a crushing weight that threatened to pull him down to the floor. But beneath the fatigue, a spark of grim determination flickered. He had survived. Whatever he had done, it had worked. Or, at least, it had stopped that. He needed to leave. He gathered nothing, simply pushed through the front door, leaving it ajar behind him. The cool night air on his face was a shock, a sudden, sharp reminder of the world beyond the cabin's walls. He didn't look back. The drive was a blur. He remembered little beyond the grinding drone of the engine, the endless tunnel of the forest road, and the insistent, phantom ache in his palm. He drove for hours, pushing the vehicle faster than was safe, the landscape slowly morphing from dense, forgotten forest to sparser woods, then to scattered farms, and finally, to the first signs of a larger settlement. The structure was stark, functional, bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights. A line of vehicles stretched before him, their taillights glowing crimson in the early morning haze. The sight of other people, going about their mundane lives, felt surreal, almost offensive. Did they know what lay beyond the veil of their ordinary existence? His turn came. A stern-faced official, clad in a crisp uniform, peered into his window. The official's eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over Reid's disheveled appearance, his dirt-smeared clothes, the wildness in his eyes. "Purpose of travel?" the official asked, voice flat and devoid of inflection. Reid opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt dry, constricted. It wasn't just an ache now, it was a presence, a faint, resonant hum that seemed to sing in his very blood. The official frowned, leaning closer. "Sir?" The knot he had torn from the earth, the heart of the entity, wasn't gone. It hadn't been destroyed. He hadn't vanquished it. He had merely relocated it. The cost wasn't just exhaustion or a phantom ache. The cost was himself. He was the new anchor. The horror wasn't gone, it had simply found a new vessel. The official's gaze intensified, suspicion hardening their features. He had survived, yes, but he was no longer simply Reid. He was something else now, something tethered to an ancient, unspeakable horror, and the true fight had only just begun. The realization had been a cold shard of ice, not just in his mind, but deep within his chest. He hadn't vanquished anything. He hadn't destroyed the gnawing heart of the cabin's malevolence. He had merely displaced it. He had pulled the gnarled, pulsing knot from its ancient bed in the hearth, yes, but then what? Where had it gone? The memory of that moment was fractured, a kaleidoscope of pain and desperation. He remembered the sickening tearing sensation, the earth groaning beneath his hands, the surge of raw, cold power that had slammed into him, through him. And then, a terrifying blank where the definitive act of destruction should have been. He stood in the wreckage of the cabin, dust motes dancing in the meager light filtering through the broken windows, each speck a tiny, mocking reminder of his failure. It was the smell of the knot, he knew, or what remained of its influence. It clung to his clothes, to his skin, a phantom presence that no amount of scrubbing would ever truly erase. His body ached, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond physical exertion. It was the fatigue of a soul stretched thin, frayed at the edges. He had tried to wash them, but the grime seemed to have seeped into his very pores, staining him from the inside out. He was no longer just Reid, the man who had inherited a cabin. He was Reid, the man who had disturbed something primal, something that now clung to him like a second skin. He didn't look back as the old truck's engine coughed to life, spitting out a plume of acrid exhaust into the still forest air. The cabin, with its gaping maw of a doorway and shattered windows, seemed to watch him, a silent, predatory eye in the verdant expanse. The forest itself seemed quieter now, not peaceful, but holding its breath, waiting. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a follow-up, a slow, deliberate pursuit. The truth was a slow-acting poison. He hadn't destroyed the entity. He had internalized it. Or, perhaps, he had simply become its new vessel, its temporary host, carrying its essence out into the world. This was the terrifying reveal, the cruel twist of his supposed victory. He had saved himself from the cabin, only to become the cabin's next iteration. He kept his hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if trying to squeeze the sensation out, but it was useless. It was in him. The first sign of civilization, a faded road sign, brought a jolt of something akin to fear, not relief. How could he re-enter the world like this? What would he bring with him? The familiar sight of asphalt beneath the tires, the distant drone of other vehicles, only intensified his paranoia. He was a contagion, a walking threat. Hours later, the truck rumbled to a stop at a border checkpoint. A small, utilitarian building of concrete and glass sat beside a raised barrier arm. Reid rolled down his window. One of the officials, a stocky man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached, a clipboard held loosely in his hand. "Evening," the official said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Anything to declare?" Reid swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. His gaze darted to the rearview mirror, then to the dense forest stretching back behind him. Did he see it? Did he sense the foreign presence thrumming beneath Reid's skin? They was the official simply doing his job. Was there an unspoken recognition in his gaze, a flicker of understanding for the haunted look in Reid's eyes? Purpose of travel, the official continued, his pen poised. Leaving, Reid said, the word tasting like ash. Just leaving. The official made a brief notation, then stepped back, gesturing vaguely towards the barrier. All right. Have a good night. The barrier arms slowly lifted with a mechanical whine. Reid shifted the truck into gear, his foot heavy on the accelerator. He drove through, past the official, past the checkpoint, into the uncertain expanse of the road ahead. He didn't look back. The mundane glow of streetlights seemed sickly, the distant rumble of traffic a low, predatory growl. He was out of the forest, yes, but the forest had come with him. The victory was bittersweet, indeed. He had survived, but at what cost? The horror hadn't been vanquished, it had merely found a new home, a new way to transcend time. The knot, he knew, was still there, unseen, unheard, a silent passenger on his journey, waiting for its next opportunity to unfurl. He was free, but freedom was just another word for exile, and he was exiled into a world that would never look the same again.